Now, the race to be the Republican candidate is pretty bland, let's be honest. Not much is said. But Newt Gingrich dared to say there is no Palestine, no Palestinians, just Arabs living in the area, obviously, who were really told they were Palestinians as recently as 1920. Now, is it true? I happen to believe it is. One of the world's leading experts on the region is Daniel Pipes, who joins me now from Los Angeles. Welcome to you, sir.
Thank you.
Now, my reading, and I'm a mere amateur compared to you, but it seems to be in 1920 and the British involvement in the region, post-Ottoman Empire, that the idea of Palestine is, in fact, a very new concept.
Exactly. There was no such concept among Muslims of a Holy Land, and it was delineated, Palestine was delineated after World War I by the British, and this was a success for the Zionist movement. The drive to build a Jewish state started with creating an entity called Palestine. The Muslims who lived in that region didn't care for this, reacted coolly to it, and eventually, in 1920, came around to it because they realized that this was their administrative unit and they had to adapt to it. Now, over the course of 90-plus years, that unit has become real, and there are real passions and nationalist feelings about Palestine. But it's very clear that a century ago there was no such place among the Muslims of that region. There was no sense of being Palestinian or the existence of an entity called Palestine.
Mm-hmm. Now, contemporary...
Something the British brought.
Contemporary Palestinians, Muslim and Christian, I think this is an important point because they say that there's unity in being Palestinian. But when we look back at the records, a Muslim living, say, in I don't know, Ramallah, thought far more commonality with a Muslim living as far as Algeria or Yemen than they would with a Christian living in the next village. They didn't think of themselves as being one common group.
Precisely. A Muslim living in Ramallah a century ago would think of himself as a member of a family, of a tribe, of a clan, on the one hand, or a member of Sham, of Syria, a large geographic unit on the other hand, or, as you suggest, a member of the Muslim community, the Ummah. But he did not think of himself as Palestinian. It just simply didn't exist. And for many years after the creation of Palestine, it was an ephemeral and rather insignificant affiliation. It would be like being part of some administrative unit that has no particular relevance to you. But yes, it has grown. There's no denying that there is a Palestinian nationalist sentiment today. Absolutely. And there's no denying either that there is, for example, a Jordanian nationality that was created almost at the same moment, in 1921, and by the same people, the British. But no one is claiming that the Jordanian nationality goes back for millennia, whereas, for example, the Palestinians claim that Jesus was a Palestinian, or they claim that they trace from the Jebusites, from the biblical period, and so forth, the Canaanites. That's nonsense. I mean, there might be some descendants from those people, but there's no identification as Palestinian before 1920, not by Muslims.
Hand in hand with this idea that Palestine has an ancient history, is also the expunging of Jewish identity in the area. The temple, for example, and for Christians watching, the temple where Jesus was, the Jewish temple, we now have even, I'm not talking about the extreme, but we have fairly mainstream Palestinians saying, no, there was no temple, there's no Jewish presence here. This just defies human belief.
It is extraordinary, the Palestinian national movement as a whole, including politicians, so-called scholars, religious figures. They adamantly insist at this point that there's no Jewish connection to Jerusalem and that the Jewish connection is made up. This defies logic and fact. Historically, the Islamic relationship to Jerusalem has been premised on the Jewish connection, and it's completely political, it's completely fraudulent, and yet it is what sermons and school textbooks and the media are promulgating without cease today. There's an attempt to say that Jerusalem is a Muslim town, has always been a Muslim town, is sacred in the Islamic religion, and is meaningless to Jews and, by extension, to Christians. It's quite a phenomenal claim. It hasn't got much following outside of the world of Islam, but it has quite a considerable one within. There's a fervent adherence these days to Jerusalem among Muslims. I call it Muslim Zionism. And in some ways it's more alive and more fervent than Jewish Zionism, love of Jerusalem. It's quite extraordinary.
First time I visited Jerusalem
was
in 1979,
but real.
And even then, although there was a certain attachment, Jerusalem had relatively little resonance within Islam. Yet now, just 30 years later, this contrived obsession. I know it's meant to be the third holiest place in Islam, but there's a huge gap between Mecca, Medina, and then Jerusalem. There's really no comparison.
Well, even that is somewhat suspect. That notion that Jerusalem is the third most holy city to Islam dates from the Crusader period. Yeah. What's so interesting about it's a complex topic over history, but to simplify it, in general, when Jerusalem has been not in the hands of Muslims, it has become important. And when it is in the hands of Muslims, it's not important. And so during the Crusader period, a hitherto insignificant town that had been ignored and was doing poorly, because the Crusaders came and made it their centerpiece, the Muslims responded by saying, well, no, it's our centerpiece. It's our third most holy city. Yeah. And that was in response to the Crusader conquest of Jerusalem. And then when the Muslims got it and conquered it back, they proceeded to ignore it. And the population descended, the economy descended. It became an unimportant town until in 1918, the British conquered it. And then in 1967, the Israelis conquered it. And then those conquests by non-Muslims made it again very important. But I don't really think Jerusalem is in the league of Mecca and Medina. Mm-hmm. Mecca and Medina are the cities that are holy to Islam. Jerusalem is the city that's holy to Jews and to Christians.
Fascinating stuff, as always. Thank you so much for your time. I do appreciate it.
Thank you.